The week that followed felt like a month. Marcus came back to me 11 days later with a folder and an expression that told me everything before he ever opened it. He sat down across from me in my own living room. Sandra was at a conference in Cincinnati. He placed the photographs on the coffee table with the careful deliberateness of a man who had delivered bad news many times before. The man in those photographs was my business partner. His name was Gary Whitfield. I had known Gary for 19 years. We had co-founded a small engineering consulting firm together 8 years before I retired, a side venture that had done reasonably well, and that I sold my share of when Carol got sick. Gary stayed on as the sole operator. We still had lunch every few weeks. He had stood in the back of the room at my wedding to Sandra and raised a glass during the toast. He had clapped me on the shoulder and told me I deserved happiness. There were 17 photographs. Sandra and Gary at a restaurant I had never been taken to. Sandra and Gary at a hotel on the north side of the city. Checked in under his name. One timestamp, then another, then another. The dates in the photographs went back 14 months. They had been together for 14 months. We had been married for 2 years. I sat in my living room for a long time after Marcus left. I thought about Carol, about the way she laughed with her whole face, about the sound of her voice calling me into the kitchen when dinner was ready. I thought about all the mornings I had swallowed those capsules without question, because I believed someone loved me and was taking care of me. And I thought about what Phil had said. Over time, it would kill me. Sandra had taken out a life insurance policy on me for $400,000 6 months after we married. Diane confirmed that when I went to see her. She also confirmed that Sandra had convinced me to update my will to include her as primary beneficiary for the house and the majority of my retirement accounts. She had done it gradually, incrementally, with explanations that sounded reasonable every step of the way. Diane sat across from me with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and said, "Robert, I need you to understand something." She was very deliberate about this. This took planning. Then she paused and said the sentence that settled into my bones like cold iron. "This is not a crime of passion. This is premeditated. I had been the plan all along. I need to tell you what I did next because I want you to understand that I was not reckless and I was not impulsive, even though every part of me wanted to be. I was methodical. I took my time. Phil had already filed a formal report with the county health department documenting the poisoning, which triggered an automatic notification to the police. A detective named Sharon Reyes contacted me, and I sat with her for 3 hours and gave her everything. Marcus's photographs, the financial documents Diane had compiled, the supplement bottles, which I had not touched since photographing them. She took the bottles into evidence. The lab confirmed the presence of arsenic trioxide in both unlabeled bottles. Arsenic trioxide in capsules prepared by hand, or by someone with pharmaceutical knowledge and access to compounds not available over the counter. Detective Reyes asked me whether Sandra had connections to pharmaceutical supply chains through her work. I told her Sandra had been a pharmaceutical sales representative for 15 years. I stopped taking the supplements entirely and told Sandra they were upsetting my stomach. She bought new ones. She was attentive about it. She asked twice if I was feeling better. I said I was improving, and I was. Significantly. Within 3 weeks of stopping the capsules, the headaches had been reduced by half, and the trembling in my hands had nearly stopped. Phil monitored my blood work every 2 weeks. The arsenic levels were declining. During that period, I kept everything normal. I had dinner with Gary twice. I sat across from him and talked about football and the state of the city's infrastructure projects. And I looked at a man I had known for 19 years and thought about how completely I had misjudged him. He had been at my first wife's funeral. He had shaken my son's hand and said he was sorry for our loss. And then, less than 2 years later, he had been sleeping with the woman who was poisoning me. Those dinners were the hardest thing I did in the entire ordeal. Harder than any conversation. Harder than any paperwork. Harder than sitting in Phil's office and hearing the word poisoning for the first time. Sitting across from Gary and pretending. Feeling the weight of what I knew pressing against the inside of my chest. Daniel drove up every weekend. He knew everything, and he was my anchor through all of it. He wanted to confront Gary himself on at least 4 separate occasions. And every time, I told him the same thing. We were going to do this correctly. We were going to let the system work. Because I wanted this to be permanent. I wanted there to be no gaps, no angles, no path for either of them to slip through. Detective Reyes worked with the district attorney's office for 6 weeks. They built the case quietly and thoroughly. They obtained Sandra's phone records and found communication with a chemical supplier, a company that dealt in industrial compounds, including arsenic trioxide, and which had no legitimate reason to be in a pharmaceutical sales representative's contact history. They found wire transfers from a joint account Sandra and I shared, transfers I had never authorized, totaling just under $60,000 over 18 months. The money had been directed into a second account in Sandra's name alone, an account I had never known existed. The morning they arrested her, I was at the library. Tuesday morning, same as always. I was sitting across from a 54-year-old man named Glenn who was learning to read for the first time in his life. We were working through a paragraph about a boy and his dog, and Glenn made it through the whole thing without stopping once. Then he looked up at me with a smile that was one of the most genuinely joyful things I have ever seen. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Detective Reyes. In custody, I excused myself and walked out to the parking lot and stood in the cold November air for a while. Gary was arrested that same morning. He was not charged with the poisoning. Investigators could not establish that he had direct knowledge of the arsenic, though I have my own beliefs about that and I keep them to myself. He was charged with fraud and conspiracy related to the financial transfers, which Sandra had apparently been funneling into a shared account both of them had access to. He had known about the money. He had taken the money. The arraignment was covered by the local news. I did not watch it live. Daniel was with me that evening. We ate dinner together at the kitchen table, and I told him about Glenn getting through the paragraph without stopping. Daniel laughed, and for a little while, we talked about ordinary things. That may not sound important, but it was, because after weeks of poison, deception, evidence, police reports, legal documents, and the cold machinery of criminal procedure, sitting there talking about one man learning to read felt like proof that the world had not been fully corrupted, that something clean still existed inside it, that not everything had been touched. The trial took place the following spring. Sandra's attorney argued that the poisoning was accidental. He claimed the supplements had been sourced from a disreputable online supplier, and that Sandra had not known they were contaminated. The prosecutor spent 40 minutes methodically tearing that argument apart. The chemical supplier's records, the unauthorized account, the insurance policy, the updated will, the photographs of the affair with Gary, establishing motive, piece by piece, document by document, no theatrics, no wasted motion, just the truth, laid down in order. Phil testified about my blood work with the steady precision of a man who had given expert testimony before and knew how to be clear without becoming cold. He looked at the jury and told them that if his patient had continued ingesting those supplements at that rate, he would likely have been dead within 18 months. Sandra sat at the defense table in a gray suit and looked straight ahead. Gary testified under a cooperation agreement. He admitted knowing about the financial transfers. He denied knowing about the arsenic. He looked older than I had ever seen him look. And watching him on the stand, I realized I felt very little. Not the fury I had expected. Not the grief. Just a quiet, settled clarity. These were two people who had decided that my life was worth less than the sum of my assets. And they had been wrong. Now they were going to face that. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Sandra was convicted on charges of attempted murder, aggravated assault, and financial fraud. The judge sentenced her to 22 years. She will not be eligible for parole until she is 73 years old. Gary was convicted on fraud charges and received 4 years. I understand that is not symmetrical, and I have had to make a certain kind of peace with that. After the sentencing, I stood on the courthouse steps in the April sunlight. Daniel put his arm around my shoulders, and we stood there for a while without saying anything. A reporter nearby wanted a statement. I shook my head. I want to tell you what I learned from all this, because I think it is worth saying plainly. I learned that grief makes you hungry for connection in a way that can override your judgment. Not because you are foolish, because you are human. I was not a naive man. I was an engineer. I had spent my career thinking about structural integrity, about what holds and what gives way under pressure. And I still handed my trust to someone without testing it, because I wanted very badly not to be alone anymore. She was warm. She was attentive. She asked good questions. She laughed at the right moments. And I wanted it to be real. I also learned that the people who love you will tell you uncomfortable truths, and you should listen. Daniel asked me the night of that Christmas dinner if I was sure about her. He was 29 years old. and he noticed something in one evening that I had failed to see in 14 months. I dismissed him. I want to be clear about that. The warning was there. I chose not to hear it. I sold the house this past fall. I could not live comfortably in the place where she had handed me poison every morning, said good morning, and asked if I had slept well. I bought a smaller house 2 miles away. Better kitchen. Workshop in the garage. A place where I can do woodworking without navigating around Carol's old gardening supplies that I had never moved. That felt like the right kind of fresh start, not erasing anything. Just beginning something new in a space that had no history in it yet. Daniel visits most months. He got engaged in January, and the wedding is next September. I have been asked to give a toast, and I have been thinking about what I want to say. I think I will say something about the way genuine love is not hungry. It does not arrive quickly and push you toward decisions. It is patient. It tolerates questions. And it does not need you to look away from the details. Glenn, the man from my Tuesday morning literacy class, finished his first complete novel in February. It was a Western, 412 pages. He called me to tell me, and his voice was shaking with something I can only call pure, uncomplicated pride. I told him I was honored to have been part of it. That phone call, I think, was the moment I knew I was fully back in my own life. Not just surviving it, living it. Phil and I have lunch every few weeks now. He has stopped apologizing for the news he delivered that morning in his office, because I have told him repeatedly that delivering that news was the most important thing anyone has done for me since Daniel drove up during those first 6 months after Carol died. Phil shrugs when I say that and tells me he was just doing his job. I tell him that doing your job with that kind of directness and courage is not nothing. Most people would have softened it. Most people would have offered other explanations first. He looked at me across his desk and told me the truth as clearly as he knew how to tell it. And that clarity gave me time. I still think about what might have happened if I had not gone in for that routine checkup. If I had blamed the fatigue on age and kept swallowing those capsules, never knowing what was in them until it was too late. I try not to sit with that thought for long, but sometimes in the early morning before the house is fully light, I let it come for a moment. Then I get up. I make my coffee. I go to the workshop. I start something with my hands. And that is enough. That is more than enough. There are bridges I built in this city that are still standing. Some of them have been standing for 25 years. When you design a bridge, you account for every force that will act on it, the weight of traffic, the pull of wind, the expansion of metal in summer heat, the contraction of it in cold. You build in redundancy. You assume the structure will be tested, and you build it to hold anyway. I think that is the only philosophy I know how to offer. Build in redundancy. Assume you will be tested. And when someone you trust tells you to look more carefully at something you have been taking on faith, look carefully. Not because the world is full of people who mean you harm. Mostly, it is not. But because the few who do will always look for the places where you have stopped paying attention. And if you leave those places open, they will walk right through them. I am 63 years old, and I am still here. That is the whole of it. That is everything. If this story stayed with you, pass it on. Someone out there may need to hear it before it is too late.